Welcome, everybody, to the fifth workshop in the Responsible Conduct of Research workshop series. I'm going to run over a few things very quickly before we begin today. For any of you who have not joined us previously on this series, we offer a variety of other series. We have one more in Responsible Research in 2 weeks from now on the IRB, and we also have one more translational teamwork this semester on April 14th. So those are both 2 weeks from now. I will put information in the chat on those series as well as the whole entire library of workshops that we offer. If you're interested in a certificate of completion, you have to attend all 6 sessions in the series. And if you missed any for any reason, contact me. I'll put my email in the chat and we can work something out for you. We do offer a micro-credential in responsible research, so I will put information in the chat on that as well. And for any physicians in the audience, we offer continuing medical education credits, so you're eligible to receive those for today. All right, today's presentation is on the IACUC and ethical use of animals in research. Our presenter is Dr. Albert Titus. He's Senior Associate Vice President for Research and Professor in the Department of Biomedical Engineering in the Jacobs School. So please go ahead, take it away.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining today. And again, my name is Albert Titus. So just as a little bit of background, I am in the Vice President for Research office. The different entities that report to me include the lab animal facility here at UB, as well as the IACUC and IRB as well. So among other things. So we'll just get started. So we have 4 parts for this. The first part is a general framework that we'll talk about for understanding the ethical pros and cons for the use of animals in research and teaching. Primarily, we'll be talking about research, but the same guidelines apply to teaching. That really, there's no difference. As well as information about resources and the regulations that govern the care and use of animals in research and teaching. So part 2, we'll talk about some regulatory guidelines and the function of the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, or what we call IACUC, as well as the investigator responsibility, which is for most of the folks on here. Part 3, I'll discuss the application or how we apply the NIH regulatory principles to projects and theoretical examples involved there, and then a few references in part 4. So as we go through this, feel free to put questions in chat. We'll address those as we go, and then also we'll have a little short quiz, actually a couple question quiz toward the end of each section. There we go. So what is their objectives today is the participants who will use animals in research or teaching. The goal of this is that you'll receive background to the NIH and USDA regulations and accepted practices regarding the use of animals in research and teaching. You'll obtain an understanding of the multiple roles the IACUC plays in supporting animal research at institutions and, of course, at UB. And understand the elements of a research protocol that serve as the basis for IACUC decisions when you submit a protocol to use animals for research or teaching, and be able to approach the animal use application form to better convey the rationale and methodology of the animal research for IACUC review. So essentially, that means when you submit your protocol, what are the things you should be thinking about to make sure that you're able to explain and justify the use of animals in your research. So to start with in part 1. Ethical basis for animal research. So it's important to start off in the very beginning and say, okay, well, we're using animals in research. We have used animals in research for quite some time. It's the responsible advancement of bioscience and medicine has historically depended on the use of animals first and then humans in scientifically relevant and ethically justified research. The studies that use animals that we perform, that you may be performing, have performed, are reviewed and approved by IACUCs and IRBs, who serve as society's gatekeeper. Again, IRB for humans, IACUC for animals. So why is this, or what does this even mean? It's that, where does this come from, is that the society has determined this in a sense, right? Where we as a society have developed, this is the process that we feel that we should be looking to animals to help inform decisions for humans. And then FDA often, or almost always, will ask for animal results before approving human studies for new devices or treatments. But who gives us the authority to be able to do this? So again, because these two things are closely, parallel, and they do parallel each other in this slide. If we look at the human subject research and animal subject research, where animal meaning non-human. So there are federal regulation guidelines such as OHARP, or the Office for Research Protections, that's out of HHS, Health and Human Services. Animal subject research is governed by OLAW, the Office of Lab Animal Welfare, and then NIH, as well as the USDA, depending on species and the type of research, et cetera. Institutional oversight. So now we have federal regulation guidelines at the top. Those drive institutional oversight. Institutional oversight for human subject research is the Institutional Review Board, or IRB. And then the similar board for at the local level, at the institutional level, is the IACUC, as I mentioned, for looking at animal research. There are accreditation bodies for each type of research program. The one is called AHARP and the other one is called ALAC. You can see the acronyms there. AHARP for human subject research, ALAC for animal research. And the consent provider for this different type of research, for human subject research, obviously, if you see a study is advertised and you say, oh, I want to participate in that study, it could be just a survey of your favorite food, or it could be a human subject study where you are going to be participating in a drug trial. Anything like that involves you, us humans. Who provides the consent? Well, it's the person who is having this, who's performing or who's engaged in the research. In other words, I would have to consent for myself. There are issues with others that may need consent, but the human consents. When we get to the animals, the question asks, who consents for the animal? Does a mouse or a rabbit or a rat consent for the research? And that's the big question mark. So we can't get consent forms. Mostly the animals aren't very good at writing and signing their name. So where does our right to use animals come from? So to protect the animals, federal agencies have established a set of principles for utilization of animals in research and training. So since we can't get animal consent, we have to have things in place to enable that. So why are there special treatment for animals? Well, I think some of these are pretty obvious, that there are no legal rights for animals. Animals, as their animals are not suing, the rabbits are not suing, the mice are not suing us. They can't consent or withdraw from a study, obviously, but they do experience pain and discomfort and distress like humans do. So it is essentially our legal and moral responsibility to treat animal subjects as humanely as possible. So because animals tend to hide, as a defense mechanism, they hide pain and distress. That's how they respond. So we have developed as a society, through the federal government governing all of this across the states, in the United States, these set of principles that have really been driven by society, that have turned into laws and federal regulations to guide our utilization of animals. So, and that's because they're not able to protect themselves, in a sense. So if the animals didn't experience pain and discomfort, why would we then use them for research if we're trying to develop things that eventually for humans? And so there's also a legal responsibility involved for us that drives all of this. So we start off at the why, because it's important to understand why and to think about this as we develop our animal protocols. So, and again, as I mentioned there, is that as a society, we have decided, and there, again, it may not be a unanimous decision, but we have decided as a society that we're morally justified in using our animals, using some animals for our needs, but only with due consideration, and that we must treat them humanely. So basically, even though we justify their use, we have a moral obligation to see that they are given decent treatment, adequate food, water, and shelter, and a lifestyle as close to normal as possible for them, so that what we are doing is we are taking on the responsibility of using these animals for research that can hopefully, the goal is to help humans, but we also have to recognize that, hey, yes, we have this responsibility to the animals to treat them as humanely and as humanely as possible, and because we have the advantage of being able to use them in this role. So that's what we've decided as a society. That's how we set up the structure that enables this to go on. So we could ask the question, are animals here for us or for themselves? And that's a valid question to ask, and it's not one I'm going to answer. But by thinking about that, it says, okay, well, what we should do is we should do what we need to do because we've decided as a society that we should do this, but we should only disrupt what we must disrupt to be able to get to results that we want. So that's why providing food and adequate food, water, and shelter, and a lifestyle for them and treating them well, because we don't want to disrupt too much. So it really is a cost-benefit analysis that has to be done, that asks that the benefits derived from the use of animals for biomedical or behavioral research is offset. The cost-benefit analysis is that those offset the associated moral cost of using an animal for human purpose. So we look at this and say, okay, we're going to use animals for this, but the benefits we get are so big that it justifies the moral cost of saying, okay, we're going to use animals for this function. We have to perform that. So that means the researchers, all of us who do use animals, must provide this information to the IACUC, the Institutional Review Board that does the animal protocol reviews. So the IACUC can make the decision, is this research justifiable from the standpoint of benefiting humans eventually against the harm to the animals that goes on. So the PI's application for animal research is evaluated for the animal use protocol. That's what the IACUC does. I mean, you could get into different aspects where you're looking at, does the recipient of the research matter? In other words, animals may benefit from research on animals, right? So you could think about pollution in the water, that could benefit fish because they live in the water, for example, and it would benefit humans as well. So there is that, but that gets into some of the nuances. So for background, prior to the Animal Welfare Act, which we will discuss in just a second, the research community, it was determined, had failed to meet societal expectations for proper treatment of research animals. Chimpanzees, chimps, different types of primates were being mistreated and essentially tortured. Animals were subject to gunshot wounds, had terrible housing conditions with no concern for their welfare. And then the perception, or even the fact, really, that pets were being used as subjects, basically picking up animals off the street to be used for animal research. This was felt that this was not acceptable to society, rightly so. And by the mid 1900s to later 1900s, it was decided that no, there's just too many examples of this going on. It's not acceptable. There needed to be policies that protect animals at the same time as allow research to go on that can benefit humans. So that led to the Animal Welfare Act in 1966, or the AWA, that regulates the treatment of animals in research, teaching, testing as well, exhibition, transport, and by dealers. So For us, it's probably more so in this discussion, it's more related to research, teaching, and testing as opposed to exhibition. In other words, like a circus, let's say, or something like that. But it applied, the Animal Welfare Act applies to all of these. It gives USDA, the Animal Welfare Act gives USDA oversight for warm-blooded vertebrate animals, except for birds, rats, and mice. And then through the APHIS, or the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, the AWA regulates animal sources, housing, transport, use, etc. So then in 1985, there was an update to this that directed the U.S. Public Health Service to oversee all vertebrate animal use. So going beyond just that smaller group to all vertebrate animal use in research and teaching. And this was done through the offices of NIH via OLAW, as I mentioned before, the FDA and CDC. So this is, again, the Animal Welfare Act, as well as the updates in 1985. This was based on the federal decisions that we have a legal responsibility to protect the animals. So these types of the Animal Welfare Act lays out different conditions, different criteria, lots of different specifications, such that it dictates cage size, cleanliness, etc. Those types of things for animals. Food and water provided, proper lighting or sound conditions, all of which need to be maintained. But then at the same time, you could start to think about, well, my research involves hearing, so we have to expose animals to loud noises or sound deprivation. So if that's a case, then your protocol then has to get into justifying why those things can be done and why they should be done. So there are conditions that have to be met, but the research may require that those are not maintained in certain cases, but that has to be justified. So, for example, OLAW, as I mentioned, added birds and rodents and cold-blooded vertebrates such as frogs and fish, etc., to the list. So, if we look at kind of how does this all fit together? So, OLAW and APHIS, those require that we have institutional assurance, that we have an institutional official, and that we have an IACUC. So these federal policies say there are three things that that you as an institution, in this case, University of Buffalo, in order for us to receive federal funding, in order for anybody here who is receiving federal funding, who is at the University of Buffalo or whatever institution you're at, to receive federal research funding from the NIH and other sources, because of agreements between the NIH and other agencies, you need to have institutional assurance, institutional official, and an IACUC in place. So the institutional assurance is the detailed process and procedure plan for compliance with the regulations. So we have to have this plan in place. We have to have an institutional official who is ultimately responsible for the animal care and use program and compliance with the laws. At the University of Buffalo, that person is me. And then we also have to have an IACUC that approves and oversees animal-related activities, which, of course, we do have. And with these in place, and as long as these criteria are met, then we are able to receive NIH funding and as well as other agency funding. What's not mentioned here, but is relevant in New York State, is we also have the New York State Department of Health, and we get an annual certification from them allowing us to do animal research as well. So we have something called ALAC, as I mentioned on an earlier slide. So the OLAW and USDA accept ALAC accreditation as proof of self-inspection and compliance with federal regulations. So essentially we say, we're going to go and get accredited. We're going to choose ALAC as the accrediting board. They're going to come and check us out and look at our stuff and see what we're doing and read our documentation and watch what we do. And then they're going to say, yes, you meet the criteria, you follow all the guidelines, you meet the requirements, the regulations that are put forth by OLAW and the USDA. And then USDA and OLAW say, okay, since you got the accreditation, they've told us that you do a good enough job where you are meeting the requirements that we set out. So ALAC International used to be known as the longer name up there, the Association for Assessment and Accreditation of Lab Animal Care, but with like many of these groups, they've just shortened their name, so they're just called ALAC. It's a private, non-profit organization that promotes the humane treatment of animals in science through voluntary accreditation and assessment programs. Our program, UB's animal program, is accredited by ALAC. Our reaccreditation occurs every 3 years. What happens when we go through accreditation is that we have to submit a long report to ALAC, and then at some point after they've reviewed it, they will come and visit us in person several days. They will be here visiting our facilities, talking to people, etc. And then once they've gone through this, they then take this information back, and then they decide whether we receive full accreditation or if we have to make adjustments or changes. So our last accreditation occurred last year. We received full accreditation again in the fall of 2025. So that means we still have 3 years, roughly 3 years now to go before our next accreditation. UB itself has been affiliated with ALAC since 1966, so quite a long time. We've been doing this basically 1966, if you remember that date. It was when the Animal Welfare Act was passed. So from that point on, we became affiliated with ALAC, so that we've been on board since the start. The USDA, separately, the USDA does inspect it does do inspections on roughly an annual basis, but sometimes the USDA may visit more frequently. If they've come once, they may come and see something that they don't like. They may come more frequently and check up on things until they feel like things have been sorted out. So the USDA also will come themselves to visit. But that's not accreditation process, that's just an inspection. Okay, so now, as I said, we have a couple of quizzes. So we have 2 questions. We'll do one at a time. So I'm not sure, but now, there we go. Super.
Launch the first one.
All right. So if folks would read through and try to choose the best question, or sorry, best answer. It's only one question. Okay, so I think we're almost there, but I think we'll keep things.
You can end it if you like.
Yeah. So I agree. I agree that animals are our friends. I do 100% agree with that. But the best answer here would be animals cannot consent or withdraw from a study, so we need to act appropriately. So, all right, let's go to question number 2.
Okay. Question number 2 should be on the screen for everybody.
I think we're kind of slowed down here on this one. So what entity is responsible for local oversight of animal research and training? So the key word in this is the local oversight. So local oversight is the IACUC, our local IACUC. Certainly ALAC is involved in the sense of accreditation, but local oversight is the IACUC. Okay, so continuing then. Okay, so now let's go to part 2. So now let's talk a little bit about the IACUC and investigator responsibility. So we just went through kind of background, big picture, accreditation related, and regulations. So now what about the IACUC? So the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committees, or IACUC, are local institutional committees with federally mandated oversight responsibilities, including reviewing animal protocols and changes. The animal protocol is, again, the documents that a PI or the researcher submits talks about, say, hey, this is the research I'm doing, here's the animals I'm using, here's why I'm using them, here's what's going on, here are the issues, here are the concerns, etc., laying it all out. And any changes that are happened. So maybe you start a protocol and something changes. Oh, I'm going to have to change, something's not working. You'll have to change your protocol to allow that change to happen if you do something different than what was approved, or even if you're adding somebody new to the protocol, so now a new student comes in the lab, or you weren't working on this project before and you want to be working on this project, you have to be added. That's a change as well. Some are a little bit more complicated, some are easier, but again, any changes to an approved protocol must be reviewed and approved. Evaluates institutional compliance with public health policy, USDA, Animal Welfare Act, and institutional policies. That's what the IACUC does. They monitor institutional animal care and use program, including inspecting animal facilities. So again, the key thing to remember is that at the University of Buffalo, we have the lab animal facility, or the LAF, we call it. That is the group that takes care of the animals. And then there's the IACUC. The IACUC is the board that approves the use of animals in research and teaching, and they also have to make sure that the facilities we have are meeting the criteria, the requirements that are that we have for meeting the Animal Welfare Act. The IACUC reviews concerns about animal care or use, and then the IACUC also must report non-compliance and suspensions of protocols to the NIH Office of Animal Welfare, or the OLAW. So the IACUC works with the PIs, and then it also reports out to the federal level as needed. So the IACUC itself has some guidelines of what it must be like. The IACUC is a committee of faculty or staff or other people, non-affiliated UB people, for example. That includes at least one. It has to have at least one licensed veterinarian on the committee. It has to have a researcher with experimental expertise who worked with animals. There has to be a non-scientist on the committee, and then also a non-affiliated or community person who's not from UB. The committee will have a chair and an alternate, have alternates, and then it may also have non-voting consultants if needed. For example, someone from EH&S or from Environmental Health and Safety, that's the unit at UB, and also biosafety folks who look at biosafety. So there may be others that are brought in to help look at a protocol depending on what it is. So the IACUC itself, we can think about, it's easy to remember, roughly kind of easy to remember, that they're guided by the 3 R's and those core principles of replacement, reduction, refinement. So replacement, meaning use advanced technologies to use advanced technology to use non-animal models when possible, or to enable non-animal models when possible. So in other words, if we don't have to use animals, don't use animals. But sometimes we must, so we do. So replacement is, can you replace an animal with something else? Reduction is properly size experiments, or in other words, the number of animals to obtain meaningful results. It's not to say that you should minimize the number of animals possible. That gets the wording is a little bit tricky, but the key point is that you don't have to. The goal is that you should not try to use only one animal because, I could get away with just one animal. Well, can you really obtain meaningful results with one animal? That's probably not true. So it's not that you want to have the fewest total number, because the fewest number would be 0. But you have to reduce the number so that you're able to get meaningful results for whatever it is that you're doing. So in other words, properly sizing, or don't use too many, but don't use too few. So you want to reduce it so that you have the proper number of animals to get meaningful results, so that when you're using the animals, they're actually contributing meaningfully to what's happening. And finally, refinement. Look at your procedures and processes that will minimize pain and distress for the animal. Do whatever you can to minimize those things. Refine your experiments to make them as humane as possible, recognizing that in some cases it's difficult to do, but that's the goal. The 3 R's, that's what IACUC is driven by. Okay, so here's, depending on the size of your screen, it's something this is probably very, much too small to read, and that's okay because we're going to kind of go through it in different chunks. But this is available, and there's a link down there, and I think once the slides are shared, people will be able to see the link maybe more clearly, or it can be provided in chat. But maybe not be that easy to do. But so anyway, so this is available on the OLAW website at NIH. So kind of a one-page document that kind of lays out all of the different things about investigators, what they need to know about the use of animals. So we're just going to step through these. So this is the one page. Again, here's the link for that, which at this point you still can't click on because it's just a slide for you. But so that's the link, and then there's another link that'll be provided. Everything you need to know about satisfying IACUC protocol requirements. So both of these very useful documents. I think I mentioned these at the end of this presentation as well in the list. So starting with is we'll just start at the kind of the beginning point there, the highlighted text there. So repeating all of that text here is that principal investigators are responsible, PIs, in other words, the researchers that do the research are responsible for the scientific and technical aspects of a grant award and must assure compliance with PHS on human care and use of laboratory animals when using live vertebrate animals, et cetera, et cetera. So vertebrate animals include traditional lab animals, farm animals, wildlife, and aquatic animals. Okay, so basically what this is laying out is saying that PIs are responsible for what goes on in the research that they carry out when they use animals. What are the government principles that are laid out? If we go, jumping back one slide. So PHS policy incorporates the U.S. government principles. So what are those U.S. government principles? Transportation, care, and use of animals should be in accordance with the Animal Welfare Act that we already discussed. Procedures involving animals should be designed and performed with due consideration of their relevance to human and animal health for the advancement of knowledge or the good of society. Animals selected should be appropriate species and quality and minimum number required to obtain valid results. Again, that's the reduction. Methods such as mathematical models, computer simulations, etc., should be considered. That's the process of the first of the R's that we talked about. So these government principles are laid out. These are kind of defined what we're doing. So in other words, you have to be able to justify and then also consider non-animal approaches. And if you must use animals, you have to use the right number of animals. More of these government principles, avoidance or minimization of discomfort, distress, and pain. Again, this is the refinement issue that I talked about with the 3 R's. Number 5, procedures with animals that may cause more than momentary or slight pain or distress should be performed with appropriate sedation, analgesia, or anesthesia. Surgical or other painful procedures should not be performed on non-anesthetized animals paralyzed by chemical agents. So, in other words, you must provide relief to the extent possible, or if you can't do that, you have to clearly and definitively justify why you can't do that. For example, it could be that if you're trying to do some sort of, you're doing a drug development and you're trying to understand how that drug works, but anesthesia or analgesia interacts negatively with what you're trying to test, you would have to justify that and figure out and justify how else you can help the animal. And number 6, animals that otherwise would suffer severe chronic pain or distress that cannot be relieved should be painlessly killed at the end of the procedure or, if appropriate, during the procedure. So in other words, the humane endpoints must be defined in your procedure, in your protocol. You must specify those specifically. And continuing the government principles, living conditions should be appropriate for their species to contribute to the health and comfort. In other words, that's what we've talked about, that humane treatment of the animals. Normally, housing, care, and feeding of all the animals for these purposes must be directed by a veterinarian or other scientist. And in any case, veterinary care shall be provided as indicated. So this gets to our lab animal facility. Why do we provide the lab animal facility? We provide that to care for the animals in proper ways. So we have trained folks who are there who know how to properly take care of the animals so that they're able to ensure that this criteria is being carried out or being met. Investigators and other personnel shall be appropriately qualified and experienced for conducting procedures on living animals. So in other words, for number 8, this is the investigators, this is the researchers. So you have animals. If there's some procedure that's going to be done on that animal, for example, an injection or other sort of surgical procedure or other type of procedure, you must be trained. You must know how to do that before you're allowed to do it. There are some exceptions are required in relation to the provisions of these principles. So if there are exceptions that are needed, as I've mentioned, they have to be justified clearly so that the IACUC can determine whether these are allowed. And their exceptions must be made regarding principle 2 above, and it should not be based on solely for the purposes of teaching or demonstration. So based on kind of some of these principles, we'll jump into our question number 3. The IACUC is guided by 3 principles, or 3 R's. These are, all right, so what have we, so everyone chose replacement, reduction, and refinement, which is, of course, the correct answer. Jump to question number 4. Procedures involving animals that may cause more than momentary or slight pain or distress. And then complete the sentence. So to complete the answer, the correct completion to the sentence should be performed with appropriate sedation or analgesia. Choice C. Okay, so continuing on. So there's something that's referred to as, quote, the guide, or in other words, the guide for care and use of laboratory animals, or just the guide, as many people call it. This is a document, a book that is produced by the National Research Council, and it contains a significant amount of information and extremely useful that guides pretty much the IACUCs across the country in terms of looking at protocols and evaluating research activity. So it provides basically the standard for everybody. So as I bulleted out here, and you can kind of read through these, again, the same kinds of principles that we've talked about already. Consider alternatives, again, other than animals. Start with that point. Design the performance of procedures as they're really required for the relevance for humans or animal health, for the good of society, advancement of knowledge. Use the appropriate species, number, quality, and number of animals. Avoid or minimize discomfort, distress, and pain, and so on. So these, again, these same points that are spelled out in the guide is what we've talked about already, to be able to and mesh 100% with the requirements in the federal regulations. So when looking at the guide, what will be seen is that there are different types of terms in there. So there's the must, should, and may. So in other words, must, when it says must in the guide, it's something that the IACUC considers imperative and mandatory, so must happen, and to ensure humane care and use of animals. The should indicates a strong recommendation for achieving a goal, but the IACUC recognizes that certain situations may result in that could justify an alternate strategy for something. And then the may indicates that a suggestion should be considered. So it's the guide as when you look at this, and you should, it's written in terms so that the recommendations and requirements that it states can be applied in various locations, types of universities, types of institutions, and settings that use animals or produce animals for research, teaching, and testing. So going back then to our big sheet, let's go to the next kind of big heading, which is who must comply with public health policy. So kind of zooming in on that text, who must comply with public health policy. Policy applies to extramural and intramural activities supported by any PHS agency. So the extramural, that's easy for you to say, and intramural activities, meaning extramural meaning activities that the NIH funds, in other words, research grants that we get at the university are extramural to the NIH or public health. The intramural are things that go on within the NIH and their own labs. So we don't really, what we're concerned about for our sakes here is the things that are extramural, but it applies to all of them. So applies to any activities supported by any PHS agency, including the NIH, the Food and Drug Administration, CDC, and Department of Health and Human Services. All funding mechanisms, including research and training grants, cooperative agreements, contracts, conducted at domestic and foreign institutions with funds from these agencies are covered by this policy. Importantly, activities conducted or supported by other agencies such as Veteran Affairs, NASA, and the National Science Foundation are covered by the policy under a memorandum of understanding with the NIH. So essentially, it doesn't matter where the funding's coming from federally. You have to, if you're getting federal funding, you must comply with the policies. So then what is the IACUC? Well, we've already kind of talked about that, but to drill down into there, we'll jump to investigator responsibilities. So what are the investigator responsibilities? So sorry, just jumping too fast on that one. So we've already kind of discussed what the IACUC is previously, so we'll jump past that and we'll just go to the investigator responsibilities to the NIH. So investigators are accountable for the protection of the research animals in their care from the earliest stages of planning until a study is completed, including describing the use of animals in a grant application, obtaining IACUC approval prior to using animals and prior to implementing significant changes. Ensuring that research PIs or researchers, investigators are responsible for ensuring that research is conducted according to the protocol that they put in and is approved by the IACUC. So you cannot submit a protocol saying you're going to do X, and then you get the protocol approved, and then you have your animals, and then you start to do X and Y. Well, that's not allowed. Or you're going to do X minus or X plus. Those things are not allowed. You must comply with institutional policies and procedures. You must address significant changes to the use of animals in progress reports to the IACUC. And PIs, investigators are responsible for addressing changes in the use of animals that may be a potential change in scope, including changes in performance, site, or location. And it's, even though this is investigator responsibilities to the NIH, and if we jump back again, I apologize for the jumping back, for this slide, which is produced, this sheet is produced by the NIH. At the University of Buffalo, we do not differentiate based on funding source. We apply the same sets of policies as dictated by the agencies that we've described to whatever funding source you may have. So you're not trying to like juggle this, that, or the other type funding agency. We're using the same guidelines. So researchers who study vertebrate animals have a primary responsibility to their students, their peers, the institution, government agencies, and society, and to the animals that are involved in the study to do their work humanely. Fulfilling this responsibility requires a commitment to learning about relevant principles, keeping current with policy changes, and considering the moral and legal dimensions of their actions. So, in other words, to protect the animals, what we have, again, going back to the original kind of few slides, we've established a set of principles that guide our utilization of animals. So we have these guidelines that are in place that we must follow to meet the regulations. But the regulations are there for a reason, and it's also good science. It's been determined that these are the policies, but it's also good science. Essentially, you're trying to not create an unnecessary variable in your research. If you're using an animal model of a particular disease, it makes sense that you would treat these test subjects as you would any other patient, like a human patient. You don't want to do extra things that then create uncertainty in what you're trying to evaluate if you're trying to look at some particular outcome. So it's not just good to follow the policy for the policy reasons, but also for good science. Okay, we're on our next quiz.
Question 5 is launched.
So who must comply with PHS policy on animals in research? All right, I think we'll close this poll. So it's every institute engaged in activities supported by PHS must comply. All right, so answer A was the correct answer. All right, question 6. Researchers using animals must choose one best choice or best answer. So researchers using animals must, and the correct answer here, we'll close the poll, is ensure that the research is performed according to an approved animal protocol is the correct answer. They notify the IACUC after making changes to their previously approved animal protocol is not accurate because you should be notifying the IACUC before you make changes, get approval. So the correct answer is C. Right. So continuing with our one sheet, kind of stepping through these, applying for funding. So much research we do is funded. There are some research that is not funded, but most of what we do is funded because it costs money to do. So what about apply for funding? So getting into the details of this. So if you are submitting a research proposal for funding, then part of what is evaluated on is if you're including animals as part of that, then you must, the use of the animals, vertebrate animals in particular, is evaluated as part of the peer review process in determining who receives funding. So you must include a concise description of the proposed procedures that involve the vertebrate animals, and you have to include the details of those, such as what is the species, what are the strains, ages that of the animals that you're going to be using for your particular research, or when the intervention or procedures would occur. In other words, like what ages, what are the sex of the animals, and the total number of animals by species that you will use. And you have to justify the species, why you're using those species, why is that the appropriate species to use for the research you're doing, and then also explain why research goals could not be accomplished using an alternative method. So why couldn't you just do simulations? Why do you have to use mice for studying this particular drug? You must describe interventions that are going to be used, as well as humane endpoints as needed. And then you have to indicate that the euthanasia method is consistent with the guidelines, or describe or scientifically justify if it is not. If for some reason you can't perform a euthanasia method that is consistent with the guidelines, if you can't do it for some reason for this particular research activity, it has to be scientifically justified why not, and that will get pretty significant scrutiny. It'll be scrutinized in the funding mechanism when you're when your proposal is being reviewed. It will also be scrutinized when your protocol has been submitted. So how do you get IACUC approval? So if you get research funding and you don't get IACUC approval, you won't be able to carry out the research. So how do you get IACUC approval? So IACUC approval is required prior to award, except in rare circumstances. So often what happens is that you may submit a research proposal for funding, and you submit the proposal, and since there's rarely been a person who's had every proposal funded, you may end up submitting the proposal, and then you may then start working on your protocol preparation for approval. So your proposal may be submitted, and you may not have approval for your IACUC proposal. But if your proposal then comes around, gets reviewed, and you get the notification, oh, we want to fund this, before the NIH will fund the protocol or fund the proposal, you have to produce proof that your proposal has been reviewed and approved. Your protocol has been reviewed and approved by the IACUC. All right, we'll try to say that again since I just messed up everything that I said. You submit a proposal. The proposal is going to be funded. If your IACUC protocol has not been approved yet, you must get approval of your protocol from your local IACUC before NIH or whatever agency will give you the funding. So even though it doesn't have to be done before you submit your proposal, it has to be done before you receive your award. So, so when you submit your protocol to the IACUC, these are the things that you're required to put in: your research project overview, again, rationale for using animals, and the consideration of alternatives. So again, a lot of repeats here, what you would have to include in your proposal, but all of these are to justify to the IACUC, hey, IACUC is using the guide. It's saying, we're going to scrutinize this. We're going to make sure that what you're doing is acceptable. So all these same points that we've discussed already. In order to go through and get approval for your protocol, you will have to go through training before you can get your protocol approved. So you should always be looking at what training requirements are needed. And again, these are things that are provided by our IACUC itself. What trainings are needed, and then what procedures you're going to be using. You may also have to have training there. So there may be kind of online training similar to something like this, through something that we call CITI, but then there's also going to be the potential for hands-on training in the lab with the animals. So you should always be looking ahead at what training you're needed before you submit your protocol, because that could delay your protocol approval if you haven't done the training. So if you're obtaining IACUC approval, the use of animals that are described in your protocol you're submitting to the IACUC must be congruent with the description in the grant application. In other words, they don't have to be word for word verbatim because of just different issues of length, etc. But you can't be describing some protocol A in your grant proposal and then you're doing B in your IACUC protocol. They have to be essentially the same so that they match. So again, there's some links that are here. Then these links will be provided at the end as well, to be able to look at and get more details about how do you submit successful IACUC protocols. So you submitted a proposal, it's gotten funded, you've gotten your award. We're kind of skipping over the receiving an award part because you get your reward. There's lots of stuff that has to go on, including making sure your protocol is approved by the IACUC. But we'll jump to the post-award. So post-award process, okay, what's happened? So now you're able to do your research. So the IACUC review, after your initial protocol is reviewed and approved, it has to be done again at least every 3 years, or annually if it's a species covered by the USDA regulations. Significant changes in animal care and use, you have to have them approved by the IACUC before implementation. And because the word significant may seem a little bit vague, there are some things that maybe that the IACUC would say, okay, yes, go ahead, we'll get that approved, versus no, you can't do anything until we've actually reviewed it and approved it. So if you're making changes, you should always check with the IACUC first. Conducting research in the absence of an IACUC approval or implementing a significant change without IACUC approval constitutes a non-compliance. And non-compliance means a lot of paperwork on our end. Charges to grant awards to conduct animal activities. In other words, you have grant funding. You're paying for these activities out of your grant fundings. Those charges are not permitted without IACUC approval. So in other words, you cannot use money to pay for animals that are associated with a non-approved IACUC protocol. And that's true whether you haven't gotten approval or if in the bad situation where your protocol has been suspended or the protocol has expired and hasn't been renewed. A full IACUC review is required every 3 years, at least every 3 years, and there are no exceptions. Right. Next quiz. Number 7, which of these is not a required part of an animal protocol submitted to the IACUC? Slowing down, so let's stop it here. So which of them is not a required part? And in the correct answer is proof of NIH funding. And that's the correct answer because you're not required to have NIH funding to carry out, to have a animal protocol submitted to the IACUC. You're not required to have any funding, although with no funding, it will be difficult. Right, question 8. An example of non-compliance. Load down here. So an example of non-compliance is carrying out an experiment or procedure with an animal without prior IACUC permission or approval. I mean, so which is answer C. D is not correct because an animal having an unexpected reaction to a drug administered according to an approved IACUC protocol, that's not a non-compliance. That may be a reportable event. So if something goes on that wasn't expected in the procedure, that is something you would report to the IACUC, but it's not necessarily a non-compliance issue. It just because could be that, oh, well, nobody's ever seen this reaction before, for example. But it is an example of something that should be reported, but it's not necessarily non-compliance. So to kind of wrap things up today, we'll just go through a few different examples. So selection of the appropriate animal model. So essentially, you have to justify why this is the appropriate animal to meet the aims of the study. So this is something that requires a scientific justification when you're putting together your animal protocol. So in other words, if you choose a mouse or a rat or a rabbit, you have to justify why the particular animal is chosen and how it meets the aims of the study. So you could look at this as, well, if you do something else, maybe it would be better to do, a pig, for example. But a pig may be prohibitively expensive for the type of study you do, so you're going to first start off in a model that makes more, that is maybe not as advanced, but is more able to produce results that are meaningful at an earlier stage. So there are different ways of justifying it, but it has to be scientifically justified. Importantly, of course, is you have to ask the question, does the disease model, if that's something you're studying, does the disease model mimic a human disease sufficiently well? Is it an accepted model that's used? You have to be able to justify that. You can't say, one thing you cannot say is you can't say it's the least expensive model. No, you can't just choose something because it's the least expensive. Least sentient is yes. You can use justification that's the least sentient model, animal model available. Most convenient, again, that's kind of you have to be careful about how you're doing that. Just, oh, this is the easiest thing to do. That's not really a justification. But it has to be backed by scientific reasoning as well as saying, okay, well, what is it that makes this so? So then an important component of a protocol is the scientific merit of a particular project. So who determines the scientific merit or the benefit of the project? So the IACUC is the responsible, essentially, in the end, of making this determination whether your project has scientific merit. However, the IACUC will often use other sources as their justification for determining scientific merit. In other words, if it's a peer-reviewed funded project versus non-peer-reviewed or an unfunded project, for example, the fact that it's peer-reviewed by, say, an NIH study section of experts and it's funded, then the IACUC often or almost always will use that as a justification for the scientific merit of a project or proposal. So if it's a non-peer-reviewed study, in other words, it's self-funded or it's funded through a startup package or whatever that might be, unfunded studies where there's no peer review involved, then the IACUC has to ask, either they have experts on the IACUC board, the committee, or they would have to engage somebody else who is an expert in that research to be able to provide input. So the PI can assist with this process, of course, by making sure that they provide sufficient documentation or references, background, and so forth in their protocol. That will be significant help to the IACUC. Again, the scientific merit, it has to be shown to be scientifically valuable and not unnecessarily duplicative. In other words, not just repeating what other people have done just to repeat that. Procedures must be consistent with sound research design, relevant to human or animal health. And the IACUC should evaluate the scientific elements of the protocol. In other words, hypothesis testing, sample size, group numbers, etc. Because they essentially want to be able to say that, yes, you're using animals. You've checked all these different aspects. You need this many animals of a particular kind, because otherwise you would not be able to get any meaningful results. So the IACUC has to be able to make these assessments or trust the judgment of an external peer review to be able to move the protocol forward. I mentioned this briefly in the quiz, right? The unexpected adverse events, such as when early deaths or health problems are observed. Should this study be ended or not? That's the question. If something unexpected happens, so the PI must report, as I mentioned before, the researcher must report unexpected deaths or other welfare occurrences to the IACUC. Again, this does not mean that it's non-compliance. The unexpected part is really what's key. It doesn't mean non-compliance. It just means that something happened that has to be reported and documented so that we have record of this. So ending a study or not is a question that has to be discussed depending on the situation. So key thing is that what happens if something like this happens? Well, is there a plan already described that can address this? It's important to first check. Otherwise, the IACUC may recommend that you have to do more frequent monitoring or revise a procedure or whatever. So there are interventions that may have to occur when adverse events happen. That's why this should be and must be reported. So what if the proposed procedure will likely produce pain, but analgesics may interfere with the study design? Again, this is, as we talked about before, sometimes that's the case. It requires scientific justification. And it's really important that to justify this in the protocol, you have to be able to document why it is that you can't do it. There's no other ways to do this to get the results that you need. You have to provide the documentation to support that. And then ultimately with things like this, producing pain, but you can't use analgesics, then you really do have to dig into the questions of how much pain and discomfort and mortality is associated with it. And what is the true ethical cost of this? Is it really worthwhile to do this study if it causes so much pain and you can't do anything about it? Is that justified to get the end result of something that maybe is not meaningful? So that it does require, it's not a cut and dry, it's not black and white, so to speak. It needs some justification. There's grayness there, but it has to be justified. And then essentially, how do you minimize the ethical cost involved with that? So in the end, the IACUC has to be the one that weighs this ethical cost against a potential value. The PI, the researcher, your job is to be able to provide as much documentation and justification for why, but the IACUC in the end has to decide. So an animal model is being used to test possible new treatments, what is allowed in the animals, and what do we do in humans. So in other words, considering the positive and negative and humane endpoints is important. So finally, in scenario 6, if you see something, say something. So in this point, or in this example or scenario, your supervisor bought animals at a pet store and housed in the lab. Is that okay? That would not be okay. You can't just bring in random animals into the lab and use them. So what do you do if your supervisor does this? Do you go to the IACUC and tell them? Do you anonymously report something? Do you ignore it and just hope nobody notices? Well, there are real ethical issues, implications involved in something like that, where you bring in random animals into the lab, they can infect other animals. Now you have something that's very bad spreading through the lab. Nobody knows why. Nobody knows what. There's lots of different issues, but it's not allowed. So it's a regulatory issue, but there's also other problems that can arise. But if you're a young researcher or you're working with somebody, and if you then do something, you don't risk it. If you don't speak up, then it's potentially bad. Other things could happen and somebody will find out, in which case you are then responsible as well, versus if you do speak up, then you get fired, and which obviously is not an acceptable result, but that's why we have other policies in place at the university to try to prevent that. But if you see something, you should say something, and there are different mechanisms for handling that. So if there's a new procedure proposed, there are different, and the potential adverse effects are unknown, or the expertise is untried by the study group, then there needs to be more documentation, more justification, maybe a pilot study first to be able to check these out, to try to work through the problems before you go through the entire research protocol. So that's pretty much all I have for talking. Again, there's this last set of slides, which I'm not going to read through because it's, again, just the web sources, the Animal Welfare Act, the NIH guides, web tutorial, the guide, as I mentioned, different websites that have information that's useful. Again, the guide, I keep saying that, but that doesn't change it. And then the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee Guidebook, which is useful and also free, that can be downloaded. Again, these are all links that will be provided. And then, of course, something from the AVMA. So not talking through all those slides, but just referencing them so that you have them. And that is the end of my presentation. So thank you, everybody. Any questions before we wrap up today?